Lucy Letby, aged 32, enters the courtroom on the 10th of October 2022. She's wearing dark clothes with her blonde hair tied back. This woman is charged with 22 crimes carried out on neonatal infants, many of which were in the world only a few days before Letby unleashed her reign of terror. She faces 7 charges of murder and 15 charges of attempted murder. Due to legal reasons, the children are named alphabetically: Child A, Child B, Child C, etc. Before discussing each child, it's important to note that this trial is ongoing. Therefore, Letby is innocent until proven guilty. Based on the following evidence, which has been heard in court, you decide: guilty or innocent. Child A, murder charge. Child A was a small boy born premature in June 2015. He was the younger of a twin child, Child B. Child A was in good condition at birth and taken to the neonatal ICU unit. 13 hours later, he was breathing in air by himself without the requirement of medically administered oxygen. A medical chart records the fluids going in and out of Child A. He was given 1 ml of milk via a nasogastric tube at 4 and 6 p.m. A nurse had looked after Child A that day and handed over the care to Letby at 8 p.m. before she had been able to administer intravenous fluids, meaning this job was now Letby's. Child A was stable at the time of the handover. The connection of the fluids would have been after roughly 8:10 p.m, and it was recorded on the infusion prescription chart at 8:05. At 8:20 p.m, Child A was reported to have white feet and hands, and Letby called a doctor to the incubator at 8:26 p.m. Child A was rapidly deteriorating. Resuscitation procedures began, and adrenaline was administered to stimulate his tiny heart. Doctors observed an odd discoloration of Child A's abdominal skin. There was patches of pink and blue skin that seemed to appear and disappear. This presentation of symptoms will be seen on many of the babies discussed in this case. All resuscitation techniques which would have been expected to bring back Child A failed. Child A was sadly pronounced dead at 8:58 p.m. He had died within 90 minutes of Letby coming on duty. She was recorded as being the only witness associated with Child A's collapse. The case was referred to the coroner, and the cause of Child A's death was unascertained at that time. It is now hypothesized that Letby had injected air into Child A's bloodstream, which resulted in his rapid and sudden deterioration. When later interviewed by police, Letby said she had wondered whether the bag of fluid which she gave him intravenously was not what she thought it was. In an interview in June 2019, Letby claimed that she had asked for the fluids to be kept from the bag at the end to be checked, but the prosecution said there was no record of her having made such a request. This was likely completely made up by Letby to cover her own back. In November 2020, during another police interview, it was discovered that Letby had been tracking the family of Child A on Facebook. She said she had no memory of doing so, but accepted that there was evidence of this on her computer. Medical expert Dr. Evans suggested that Child A's collapse was indeed consistent with a deliberate injection of air or something else into Child A's circulation a minute or two prior to his deterioration. Only Letby was present. Another medical expert said the cause was not some natural disease process, but a dose of air deliberately administered. An independent pathologist described the cause of death was unascertained, in that there was nothing in the autopsy that pointed to why Child A had died, but the cause was most likely air administration through the long line or UVC. Child B, attempted murder. Child B was the elder twin sister of Child A, born in June 2015. She required breathing support via a ventilator at birth. A long line IV was inserted for fluids to be administered successfully. Breathing support gradually lessened and Child B was eventually stable. Just after midnight, Letby started a bag of liquid feed with Child B, with another nurse, through an IV line. At 12:16 a.m, Letby, while not Child B's designated nurse, another pattern that will repeat in future cases, took her blood gases. Approximately 28 hours after her twin brother, Child A, had died, Child B's alarm sounded and Letby had called the nurse to the child's incubator. Child B was now not breathing. A crash call was put out at 12:33 a.m. and resuscitation began. The nurse noted purple blotches and white patches all over Child B's body, and her heart rate had dropped. In a witness statement 3 years later, Letby's colleague, the designated nurse for Child B, said that she and Letby had been preparing antibiotics at the time of the collapse. After efforts to resuscitate child B, she thankfully recovered very quickly. A doctor subsequently found loops of gas-filled bowel. This was again a finding replicated many times in the upcoming cases. Child B improved until being discharged the following month. Dr. Evans concluded that child B was subjected to a form of sabotage that night. Another medical expert said an airway obstruction would cause a sudden desaturation and reduction in heart rate, but would not account for the fluoride change in skin colour and perfusion noted at the time. The medical expert said a relatively quick recovery would only be explained by a dose of air deliberately administered into the bloodstream. A blood expert added no blood disorder would account for the sudden deterioration of child B. An expert paediatrician said that the collapse and skin molting were the result, again, of air being injected into the bloodstream. In the police interview, Letby was asked about the circumstances regarding the connection of the liquid feed bag at 12:05 a.m. She said she had looked at paperwork for the lipid syringe and said the prescription was not her writing, but she had signed for it, and ideally it should have been co-signed. The rules are that 2 nurses have to sign for things administered to the babies. Letby said it was her signature on the blood gas record just before child B collapsed. Letby was now trying to claim that someone had signed her signature. The prosecution say this is an example of Letby signing the charts for a baby who again was not her designated patient at the time just before the child collapsed. Child B narrowly escaped the fate of her brother. Letby was the only person present with child A at the time he collapsed, and she was in the room when the same thing happened to child B. The prosecution state that there is no plausible alternative to an air injection. The fact that it happened in 2 cases, just over 24 hours apart, shows that this was no accident. Child C, murdered. Child C was a baby boy. In June 2015, Child C was being looked after by a nurse less qualified than Letby and had been given the responsibility as Child C was stable. The nurse had left to go to the nurses' station in the hospital, but while there, she heard Child C's monitor sound an alarm. Upon her return, Letby was already in the room, standing next to Child C's cot. It was the 3rd baby to have suffered a serious deterioration in a matter of a few days, the court heard. Letby was the only nurse who had been on duty for all 3 collapse incidences of child A, B and C. In police interviews, Letby denies that she had anything to do with child C other than the resuscitation. However, she then agreed that she'd been the only person in the room when child C collapsed. After finishing her shift, Letby searched on Facebook for child C's parents. Eerily, this was one of the first things she did after her shift was over. Dr. Evans, a doctor on the ward, had concerns about child C's sudden deterioration. As was the case with child B, Letby was not the designated nurse for child C. Letby had been assigned to another baby, and a leading nurse needed to reinforce this assignment as Letby was essentially ignoring the baby that she was assigned to. Child C had pneumonia, but the pathologist concluded child C died as a result of having an excessive quantity of air injected into his stomach via the nasogastric tube. The prosecution stated, "What we are going to see as we progress through the cases is that Letby's method of attacking the babies in the neonatal unit was beginning to develop." Child D, murdered. Child D was a baby girl, born as full term, i.e. not premature. Although born healthy, Child D had lost colour and became floppy in her father's arms. She was put under observation as she was showing signs of respiratory distress by grunting, and her temperature had dropped. Child D was admitted to room 1 in the neonatal unit, placed in an incubator and given oxygen therapy and antibiotics. She developed a very high temperature and had a rise in her heart rate. She was intubated and ventilated. She improved significantly, but was still affected by her infection. Child D had catheters inserted, and thankfully the levels of infection dropped. The doctor remarked that these were all good signs. A designated nurse was assigned for Child D, who was not Letby. Letby was the designated nurse for 2 other babies. On that night shift, Child D collapsed 3 times. The first at 1:30 a.m, the second at 3 a.m, and finally at 3:45 a.m. On each occasion, those attending were struck by the sight of molting, poor perfusion and black-brown discoloration to her skin, mainly over the trunk. There is a note in Letby's records that she was engaged in the care of a different baby at the time, but the prosecution say nursing notes suggest Letby and the designated nurse called the doctor to the room. The prosecution further allege that either the notes recorded were simply inaccurate, or Letby was setting herself up with an alibi in someone else's medical records. Child D was successfully resuscitated. At 2:40 a.m, medicine was administered by Letby and the designated nurse, who then left the room. Then, Child D collapsed at 3 a.m. Letby was in the room, and the designated nurse was not. Child D was resuscitated again, but according to the prosecution, Letby did not leave things there. At 3:20 a.m, there is a record of Letby starting an infusion, and Letby appears to have remained in the room. At 3:45 a.m, Child D suffered her third and final collapse. CPR began and Child D was pronounced dead at 4:25 a.m. The coroner gave the cause of death as pneumonia with acute lung injury. However, medical expert Dr. Evans says that a child exhibiting a window of near recovery on 2 occasions, followed by another collapse, was not consistent with the fatal evolution of antenatal pneumonia. He added that the abdominal discoloration was indeed indicative of air being injected into the bloodstream. Another medical expert stated that the clinical status of Child D the previous night was not that of a deteriorating baby who'd be dead within a few hours. She also added that an injection of 3 to 5 mils per kilogram of air would be enough to have killed Child D. Child D had been observed in distress prior to her death, and the medical expert added that this would be consistent in cases of air being injected into the system. In a police interview, Letby states that she cannot remember how she got involved. It was put to Letby that she had searched for the parents of Child D on Facebook. She said that she could not recall this, but accepted that she must have done so. She said that she could not explain why she had done it. The prosecution suggested that if she had searched for the family of a baby who she had seen die, you would know and you would remember having done it. The prosecution also added that children A to D were not expected to have serious problems, but only one of them survived, and only Letby was the common denominator. Child E, attempted murder. Child E was born premature in July 2015. He was the twin of Child F. Child E was born weighing less than 3 pounds. He was given oxygen, then weaned to air. Child E was at risk for gastrointestinal disorder, so he was started on antibiotics, IV fluids, and caffeine. He had a nasogastric tube inserted, so fluids were inserted the following day via a long line. He had mild transient high blood sugar, which was corrected with a very, very low dose of insulin, then given tiny amounts of milk the following day every 2 hours. At 9 p.m. on August 3, 2015, Child E's mother decided to visit her twin sons and interrupted Letby, who was in the process of potentially attacking her son, Child E, although Mum did not realise this at the time. Child E was acutely distressed and bleeding from the mouth. Child E's mum said that Letby had attempted to reassure her that the blood was due to the NGT tube irritating his throat. "Trust me, I'm a nurse," Letby told the mum. Letby then said the registrar would be down to review Child E and urged the mum to return to the postnatal ward. Child E's mum called her husband when she got back to the labour ward in a call lasting 4 minutes and 25 seconds at 9:11 p.m. Letby then made a note in Child F's records, Child F being the twin of Child E, after she'd gotten rid of Mum. The next time the mum visited Child E, he was in terminal decline. Letby failed to mention that Child E had been bleeding from the mouth. This is surely something important that a nurse would include in clinical notes. Letby's notes also mention a meeting that neither the registrar or the mother remember. Letby's notes suggest that Mum was present at the start of the shift and returned at 10 p.m, when neither is true. The prosecution say 9 p.m. was an important time, as it was the time Child E was due to be fed by his mother's expressed breast milk. That is why Mum attended at 9 p.m. She was bringing the milk. The phone call at 9:11 p.m. to her husband also fits the mum's timing. The senior house officer also said he had no recollection of giving advice to Letby to omit the 9 p.m. feed, as she had written in her notes. He had been on the paediatric ward most of the night until Child E entered a terminal decline. He believes the only time he had anything to do with Child E was in a secondary role to the registrar in an examination at 10:20 p.m. But around half an hour to an hour later, there was a large amount of fresh blood which had come up Child E's tube. As far as medical staff were concerned, this was the first indication of a serious problem, meaning no one else on the ward had known that Child E was bleeding from the mouth approximately 1.5 hours previously. There was a further loss of 13 mils of blood at 11 p.m. 13 mils may not sound much, but the doctor said he had never seen a small baby bleed like this. To put it in perspective, this was the equivalent of 25% of Child E's blood volume. And as we've seen previously, his abdomen developed a striking discoloration with flitting white and purple patches. CPR was started, but Child E continued to bleed. Although Letby was participating in the resuscitation of Child E, she miraculously also co-signed for medication given to another baby in room 4. Obviously, Letby cannot be in 2 places at once. Perhaps Letby was creating a future alibi. Child E was pronounced dead at 1:40 a.m. The parents did not wish to have a post-mortem, as one was not deemed necessary. However, as subsequent reviews have established, that was a big mistake. Dr. Evans said that child E's death was the result of a combination of air being injected into his bloodstream and bleeding, which was indicative of trauma. A further 2 medical experts agreed that the air was intentionally introduced into child E's bloodstream via the IV line to cause significant harm. In police interviews in June 2019, Letby was pressed over a conversation with a senior house officer. She said she had no independent memory of it. She said that she could not remember the mum coming into the room at 9 p.m. with milk, nor child E being upset, or blood coming out from his mouth. She said she would not have told the mum to go back upstairs. We have a stark contrast here between what child E's mum says and what Letby says. The prosecution stated that it appears that information has been wiped out from the clinical records by Lucy Letby because she knew the consequences of child E's mum being right about this. Letby went on to take an unusual interest in the family of child E. She did social media searches on the parents 2 days after child E's death, and on August 23rd, September 14th, October 5th, November 5th, December 7th, and even Christmas Day. There was also further searches in January 2016. It's unclear why Letby had a heightened interest in this family compared to some of the other children. Child F. Attempted murder. Child F was the younger twin of child E, and he required some resuscitation at birth and was either intubated, ventilated, and given medicine to help his lungs. He was recorded as having high blood sugar, so was prescribed a tiny dose of insulin. If it is known in advance that a baby cannot have milk and needs to be fed fluids, then a bag is prepared by the pharmacy unit at the hospital on receipt of prescription. It is made bespoke for each baby. It never contains insulin. That's important to note. Insulin is given via its own infusion, usually in a syringe, which delivers an automatic dose over a period of time. On that night shift, the designated nurse for child F, who of course was not Letby, was in room 2. Letby was assigned to 1 baby throughout the whole night. There were 7 babies in the unit that night, with 5 nurses working. Child F's blood glucose increased, becoming unstable several times. Child F's hormone level of C-peptide was also very low. The combination of the 2 levels, the prosecution says, means that someone must have been given or taken synthetic insulin. That is the only conclusion. No other baby on the neonatal unit at that time was prescribed insulin. To give child F insulin, someone would have had to access the locked fridge, use a needle and syringe to remove some insulin, or if they didn't do it that way, go to the cot side and inject the insulin directly into the infant through an intravenous system, intramuscular injection, or via the fluid bag. 2 medical experts said the hormone levels were consistent with insulin being put into the fluid bag prior to child F's hypoglycemic episode. Professor Hindmarch said the insulin had to have gone in through the fluid bag, as the hypoglycemia persisted for such a long time, despite 5 injections of 10% dextrose. Letby was interviewed by police in July 2018 about that night shift. She said she remembered child F but had no recollection of the incident and had not been involved in his care. She also confirmed signing for a lipid syringe at 12:10 a.m. the shift before. Prosecutions say she should have had someone co-sign for it. She accepted that the signature tended to suggest she had administered it. Interestingly though, at the end of this part of the interview, she asked whether the police had access to the fluid bag that had been connected to child F. The prosecution stated that the fact that insulin had been injected through a fluid bag tells you it wasn't a mistake. Whoever was doing it to avoid detection, and only a few people had the opportunity to do this. The prosecution also suggests there is only one credible candidate for the poisoning, the one who was present for all of the unexpected collapses and deaths at the neonatal unit. End of part 1. If you enjoy this video, please consider sticking around for part 2 and 3, which will be uploaded in the coming days. Thanks for watching.